The throne room held its breath as if it too knew a storm was clawing across the sky. Incense burned in shallow bowls along the walls, curling into the rafters where crows of smoke perched and blinked. Men and women in fine wool and richer silks stood in tight clusters, speaking under their breath, eyes tilting to the great black thing that was the Iron Throne. The swords drank light. They drank whispers. They were sharp even when no one moved. Eddard Stark felt the heat rising off the green marble steps and the weight of eyes like a cloak. Sweat gathered beneath the leather of his doublet and at the collar of his linen. He was not a man made for summer, or for cities, or for rooms that smelled of perfume and old fear. A rumble of footsteps echoed through the great doors beyond the heralds and trumpeters. Ser Barristan Selmy lifted his chin, pale hair catching a stray sunbeam from the high windows. Lord Varys arranged his hands into a nest upon his belly. Peter Baelish traced the edge of his jeweled dagger with one pinky, smiling as if he alone had heard a clever jape. Grand Maester Pycelle breathed loud enough to stir his beard. Robert came like a storm clap. He shouldered through the doors with 2 white knights at his back and a glittering train of hard-eyed men behind that. Ser Mandon Moore with his dead fish gaze, Ser Ares Oakhart young and handsome and grave. Janos Slint lumbered in the wake of kings, puffed up like a cock fat on corn. Robert wore his antlered crown and a tunic worked with a roaring stag. His broad chest filled it as if to burst the seams. He had a fresh bandage beneath his sleeve where the boar had taken him. Eddard had watched the leeches clinging darkly the night before, the wine, the laughter tilting to pain. Now the king's face was red with effort and something that was not effort at all, something that sat behind his eyes and burned. "Sound the trumpets," Robert said, his voice a hammer that rang even before the brass answered him. He mounted the steps to the throne and did not sit. The light made the iron look wet, as if it had just this moment been quenched. The king turned and took in his court. Lords of the Crownlands, the handsomely indifferent faces of Valerians and Rosbys and Hayfords. Lord Renley, green and smiling and tidy in a golden rose cloak, he could not keep from sweeping the floor. Queen Cersei in cloth of gold and lion rubies, seated with Prince Joffrey tall and pale beside her, Myrcella like a doll all ribbons and innocence, Tommen blinking. The queen's eyes were summer glass. Jaime Lannister stood below and to the right of the throne, one hand at the pommel of his gilded sword, his smile too white by half. Eddard thought of the gods would at Winterfell, the quiet, the way the leaves moved like a chest breathing. The words had been iron in his mouth last night. He had put them between himself and his oldest friend because truth could not be turned aside forever, even by love. Joffrey was not Robert's son. None of them were. He had said it plain. "Promise me, Ned." Lyanna had whispered with blood at the corner of her mouth, and the storm had been like drums and 1,000 horses. He had promised, not knowing then to whom the promise was truly made. Robert lifted one hand. The murmurs died. "Lords and ladies," he said, and the old joy was there even under the hurt, the pleasure of command. "We've a lie to skin and hang, and best we do it in the light. My hand has brought me truth, and truth is a sword best bared before it rusts to nothing." His gaze slid to Cersei for a heartbeat and gave her nothing. "Joffrey Baratheon is no son of mine, nor is Tommen, nor sweet Myrcella." For a breath the room was a Struckenville. Sound rang and rang, then it collapsed into shouting. Someone laughed, bright and unbelieving. Renly's green eyes went wide for once. Pycelle made a noise like a bellows. Varys did not move at all. Cersei rose like a flame snatching at thatch. "You drunken fool," she said. Her voice did not rise. That was the worst of it. There was steel and contempt and a kind of wild pride. She stepped forward until she stood at the foot of the steps. Jaime's hand settled on the hilt of his sword in a lover's caress. "Think what you say, Robert." "I have thought," Robert returned, tiredness sharpening him. "Gods know I have thought too little in my life, but I have thought on this. I'll say it again to your face and theirs, and I'll say it with the 7 watching. Those children are not of my body. I have no heir in them." Joffrey's mouth had gone slack. He looked from the king to the queen to his uncle to Ser Barristan, and then back to his mother with a kind of blind searching. The boy's hands were white. He did not seem real in that moment to Eddard. Only a shape cut from fine parchment, the shadows too dark at the edges. "Captain Slint," Robert said, and Janos jerked as if stung. "Your men will keep their places and their mouths sealed. I have not named you to count those who whisper in the gutters, to forget your oath when a lordling sneers. I, your grace," Slint's heavy face shone. "Ser Barristan." "Your grace. You have worn this white cloak longer than I have worn the crown, and you have served kings who were older at 10 than I have been most of my days. Will you serve me now?" Barristan bowed from the waist. There was no hesitation in him. "I am sworn to serve your grace." "Good." Robert turned to the hall. "Hear me. The line of my body is not in that golden nest." His chin indicated the dais where Cersei stood in her pride, where Joffrey gripped at shadow. Robert's hand closed and opened. "But I have a son, and I will not leave this realm to break upon itself for lack of a true name to rally behind. I fathered a boy in the north years ago, before this fool's paradise of a marriage. Lord Eddard Stark raised him as his own. He is of my blood." Eddard heard the first hiss of surprise before the words themselves registered in his bones. The room made a new sound, lower, like men breathing out at a sword's bite. He felt his heart climb for his throat. He stared at Robert and saw a man who had chosen, not in wisdom perhaps, but in a sudden fierce simplicity that was its own kind of truth. "His name," Robert said, the voice that could fill a tourney ground now steady as water in a deep well, "is Jon Snow. I do herewith legitimize him, style him Jon Baratheon, Lord of Dragonstone, and name him my true and lawful heir to the Iron Throne." Cersei's face went very smooth. For a moment, she was beautiful in a way that frightened Eddard, the beauty of a falcon at stoop. Then she laughed, bright and terrible. "A bastard," she said, "a northern brat with wolf shit still on his boots. You would shame yourself so thoroughly, Robert, to cheat your own brothers and the laws of the realm for a kitchen slut's get." Ned tasted iron. The promise moved like a blade inside him. He could feel Lyanna's fingers in his hand, cold and still. He had lied once to keep a child alive. Now a second lie rose about him, a sudden thrown wall. He should speak. He did not speak. Robert's cheeks were red. "Step closer to me, Cersei," he said pleasantly, "and I will knock you down and toss you from those steps." "The law?" he spat. "I am the law while I sit this chair. I name the boy my heir. Let any man who would gainsay me do it now with steel. Ser Jaime, perhaps." The Kingslayer's smile was small now. His hand never left his hilt. He looked not at Robert but at Ned. The weight of that glance was a thing anyone could feel. "Ser Barristan," Robert said without turning his head, "take the prince and his brother and sister and hold them apart from the queen. Gently, they are children. Captain Slint, you will see every Lannister guard in this castle disarmed and confined. Lord Renley, you will fetch me the High Septon. I'll want him to hear a king's naming with his own fat ears." Things moved then. Swords scraped. Orders flew. Barristan did not look at Cersei as he gestured to Ser Mandon and Ser Aerys. Joffrey jerked away from the white gauntlet and nearly fell. "You cannot. I am the mother." His voice cracked to a child's squeal. Cersei took one step forward and two back, calculating. Jaime shifted, and Eddard put his own hand upon Ice's worn leather, though the blade lay elsewhere, a reflex of a man who had held steel for too many years. Varys was a statue. Littlefinger's smile grew thin as a knife. In the upper gallery, a woman fainted. It broke the tension like a tiny drum. The court began to breathe again. Robert's shoulders sagged for an instant. No one who did not love him would have seen it. Then he straightened and smiled the old wolfish grin. "My lords," he called, "go bring your scribes and your witnesses and your songs. We'll do this by the seven, by the old gods, by salt and smoke if any of you have a jar handy. We'll do it in wine and in fire, and before the day is out, the realm will know its next king." Eddard found himself climbing the last steps to stand 3 below Robert. The king slanted him a look that held. 7 save them both. A plea and a defiance, and a boy's pride. "You'll send for the lad," Robert said in a softer tone, pitched for this space between them. "Send for him quick. If Melisandre herself has a horse faster than your northern sumpters, I'll buy it." "Jon is at the wall," Eddard said, and it was a mercy then to speak unvarnished truth. "He rode north some months ago. The wall can spare one boy," Robert muttered, but his eyes flicked and did not settle on any one face, as if even he could feel the old power in those stones. He put a hand like a slab of meat on Ned's shoulder. "You'll fetch him." "And Stannis," Eddard said. The name carried weight. Robert stiffened a little. "You must write to your brother. Tell him yourself." Robert's mouth twisted. "The law," he said in a low growl, "was ever that the king name his heir. The law was that Aegon named his son and Jaehaerys named his grandson. Stannis knows the law. He knows it too well. I will write." He shifted. The bandage beneath his sleeve seeped through and left a wet shadow on the stag. "I will write and I will drink, and we will see this realm made safe if I have to drag every lord in it to heel by his ear." "Drink less," Ned said. "Drink when I please," Robert replied through his teeth, and then he barked a laugh. "And pray when you please. Seems we both will have our comforts yet." By dusk the city knew. Messengers ran like sparks along lanes and up stairways and through the markets where the day's fish had begun to stink. The bells of the great September of Baelor tolled both for the king's proclamation and, by oldest habit, as they did whenever a queen passed through its doors. Cersei went not to pray but to be seen praying. She knelt at the mother's feet and did not shed a tear. People spoke everywhere. A northern bastard, the king's blood, a wolf's whelp dressed in antlers, a victory for justice, a jest of Robert's that would turn to ash. The truth scuttled among them, changing skins with every telling, and grew larger in the mouths of those who feared it most. That night in the Tower of the Hand, Ned Stark wrote 3 letters, one to the wall, sealed with his own direwolf and the king's stag pressed together in black wax. One to Winterfell, one to Dragonstone, bearing words as careful as a man laying stones on a river he must wade. He read each to Robert and watched the king's jaw knot and loosen, as though the words were a fight he could not finish. When he slept, he dreamed of snow on cold soil, and a woman's voice that said only, "Keep him safe." At the wall, morning came thin and brittle as glass. The wind found every seam and set it singing. Ravens stirred and shuddered in the rookery's black rafters. Jon Snow rose in the chill dark and pulled on his rough spun and black cloak and went to the yard with Ghost loping silent at his heel. The wolf's coat had grown into winter. The white of him made the world seem dirtier. Jon's breath plumed. He had learned the drill master's tricks and the anger that came when boys laughed at you and the patience after it. His hands had toughened to the work and the ache set poor company but constant. He was bending to pick up a blunted practice sword when a boy came running from the rookery with a scrap of folded parchment in both hands and the look of one carrying meat into a den of wolves. "Your name," the boy said without preface. "Lord Snow the Lord Commander wants you." Ghost went still. Jeor Mormont's solar was a cold place made colder by the man in it, great and gray as a winter-burdened tree. He had Ned's letter open. The king's seal gleamed black in Charles's. "You have a friend in high places," Mormont said when Jon stood before him. "And a father, so it seems." Jon felt the ground shift beneath his feet, slow at first, then in a slide. "My lord," the old bear studied him. The wind set the shutters knocking, and the raven on the back of the chair beside the window cocked its head and said, in a voice like a rusty hinge, "King, the king claims you for his," Mormont said, flicking the parchment with 2 fat fingers. "He legitimizes you and names you heir." The words dropped like stones into a well. "By the 7 boy, I've seen madder things on calmer days." His mouth made something that might have been a smile once on a younger face. "He requires you in King's Landing. Lord Stark asks me to consent." Jon reached for a chair and did not take it. He touched the carved back with numb fingers and looked at the whorls of wood. The dust caught in them and then away. He drew in a breath that hurt all the way down. I have not taken my vows. Not yet, Mormont agreed. That was timely of you. He scratched his beard. We take men at need, Snow. We let them go at need too when it suits the wall. A king's summons is need enough. He eyed the wolf, who had come to rest silent beside Jon's leg, eyes red as coals. I'll not keep you for pride, though gods know it rankles. Jon heard the wind whistle in the chimney, and beyond it the old slow song the wall sang to itself. He thought of his brothers here, the bickering and the bruises and the small kindnesses, of Samwell's fearful laugh, of Bowen Marsh's fretting, of Donal Noy's single hand hammering truth like iron. He thought of Benjen Stark vanishing into white endlessness, and of the way night tasted on the tongue when you stood atop the ice and saw the world drop away in every direction. He thought of Robb's grin in the yard at Winterfell, of Sansa's careful stitches, of Arya throwing a shoe at Septa Mordane's back, of his father's quiet voice, always the voice one remembered after the words had faded. What would you have me do? He asked, because it seemed the last honest refuge. Put the burden in hands that had carried burdens longer and heavier. Mormont grunted. I would have you go, he said. I would have you go and make something of it. I would have you keep some part of yourself clean while the rest wades through muck up to the armpits. And I would have you remember what we are and what comes for us. He lifted his shaggy head. A light burned there for a heartbeat, not merely anger, not holy pride. Winter is not a Northman's song to scare children into their beds, Snow. Winter comes. Whether some crown sits well or ill upon your hair, the cold will find us. Remember that. The raven hopped once and said, very clearly, corn. Jon laughed then, a small sound that felt like a crack letting out pressure that might have split him. He bowed to Mormont. I will remember, he said. You'll ride with Yoren as far as Winterfell, Mormont told him. He has business in the south. From there, Lord Stark's men will take you. Mind your tongue with that black bastard, he bites when cornered. See to your kit. You leave on the morrow. Jon nodded and turned to go. He paused. My lord, the king claims me as his blood. Mormont said. He is not my father. Mormont's eyebrows went up. The raven said, Father. Jon swallowed. I do not know who my mother was. My father is Lord Stark. Mormont studied him as if he were a new device someone had brought him, whose purpose was not immediately apparent but which might prove useful. He said at last. Well enough. Go on then. I've parchment to read that will sour my bowels for a month. Jon found Sam in the yard and told him, because he had to tell someone who would not put armor over the pain. Sam stared at him with his mouth open, then shut it and dabbed at his eyes with the heel of his hand in an embarrassed gesture. I always knew you weren't just anyone, he said, attempting a grin. You're too good at being stubborn. He said his other farewells in a scattered, awkward way and slept little. Ghost lay across the door and stirred once when snow dust whispered at the threshold, then slept again, untroubled. Jon lay on his back and saw a crown of antlers floating in dark water, its prongs snagged with wolf fur. When he closed his eyes, he heard Arya laughing. In King's Landing, torches flickered along the serpentine spine of the Red Keep. Robert drank that night less than he wanted and more than Eddard liked. The king's bandage bled anew by morning. Pycelle made a mouth like a purse and tutade and said words about rest and humors and the arts of leeching that fitted Robert sourly. Yet he held court again. He stood while his scribes read the letters, while the High Septon's soft hands made complicated blessings, and he declared that, by the will of the Seven and the choice of the sovereign, the boy legitimized should be known henceforth as Jon Baratheon, Prince of Dragonstone. Shall I say prayers for the Queen's temper as well? The High Septon asked in a whisper that was meant to be sweet and sounded to Eddard's ears like curdled milk. Say a prayer for my patience, Robert told him, smiling with all his teeth, and the old priest bowed with a wobble of chins. Cersei took to her chambers and filled them with her anger. She wrote letters. She sent none. She spoke in long purring discourses to Sansa, who sat with red eyes and a posture as correct as a book's line. Sansa tried to believe none of this was happening, and when she could not manage that, she tried to believe it would right itself if only she were very good. A bastard, Cersei murmured, tracing the shape of the word like a necklace on bare skin. A bastard on our throne. The small folk love such tales. They will burn for him as they burn for the mummers. I don't understand, Sansa said helplessly. He is Jon. It's only Jon. He used to. He lived in the stables sometimes when there was no room. Cersei's smile flashed. And for that the realm should crown him? Oh, look at me, child. She took Sansa's chin between a finger and thumb. Steel your heart. This is a game for those who are not gentle. If you are gentle, they cut you open to study how you work. Jaime came and went, full of grace and contempt for everything he could not break. He laced his talk with jests, as if to prove that the world could be lightened by the cleverness of his tongue. When Cersei spoke of rescue, he tossed back his head and laughed. Rescue from what? He asked. From Robert's temper? I have seen barracks with better tempers. Be patient. But his eyes were hot as a brazier when he said it, and he found reason to loiter near the stairs where the Kingsguard passed often, counting numbers with the ease of a man who had won battles by knowing how many swords were on which side of which door. Letters went out across the realm, and replies began to curl back to King's Landing like waves returning from rock. Hoster Tully wrote in a hand made shaky by pain but firm in its vows. House Tully owed House Stark and would stand by Eddard's counsel. The Reach wrote nothing at first and then wrote so much from so many hands that sense sank in the sweetness. The Vale sent only Lysa's coy evasions about the safety of her son. Across the sea, a girl with silver hair ate a roasted horse heart and dreamed of a land she had never seen. On the island of Dragonstone, Stannis Baratheon received Ned's letter, read it twice, then burned it over a brazier and stared into the flames as if they might choose to speak. It is an affront, he said at last, to the man who had once run smuggled onions through a red fleet in a black night. It is treason in all but name. It is a king's word, said Davos, simple as a dockside rope. There is law in it. There is Robert in it, Stannis snapped. His jaw worked. The law says the king may name his heir, yes. It also says that a bastard is a bastard until a marriage bed is made for him retroactively. It says that the line should run through the male first. I am the king's brother. You are, Davos said. He had a face that did not know how to pretend understanding of things it did not. Your grace. Stannis closed his eyes briefly and opened them again. Do not bait me with courtesies, smuggler. I will have what is mine. He glanced toward the outer wall where the sea clawed the stone. Send for the Red Woman. Davos's mouth thinned, but he bowed and went. In the hall he passed Melisandre of Ass High, who walked as if the stone itself gave way for her, the red silk whispering around her hips. She smiled at him and did not slow. Firelight lived in her eyes. The Lord's hand moves, she told Stannis without preface, moving into the spill of heat from the brazier. In the flames I have seen a stag with wolf's eyes and a shadow that swallows ships. I have seen a crown of antlers hang upon a white branch. Would you hear all my seeing, or only those parts that please? I would hear the truth, Stannis said, though something like pain flickered in his face. The truth is a blade, she said, delighted. It cuts. Renly left the city with Loras Tyrell under cover of night, cloaks plain, their horses' hooves muffled in wool. It was a neat trick and kind to the eye, but not kind enough that Varys did not see it. He stood at a narrow arrow slit and watched the two men become ghosts among the lanterns. Flowers seek the sun, he murmured, and boys seek crowns because they are shiny. Then he went to the Tower of the Hand with a soft step and told Lord Stark as much as he thought the man would bear without wasting the knowledge in anger. Let him go, Ned said. We cannot hold every bird in a fist. He sat longer than was wise that night with a decanter of watered wine and a map spread before him, fingers moving lightly over the riverlands where Tywin Lannister's hounds had already been loosed. Beric Dondarrion rode with a small company carrying the king's banner to bring Gregor Clegane to justice. Ned would have gone himself if he could have been in two places. Put men on the Rosby Road, he told Harwin. Send riders to watch the gold cloaks as you would watch a river in flood. Lord Baelish says, Harwin began. Peter Baelish says many things. Ned cut him off, weary to the bones of it. He counts coins and whispers into cups. I count men. In the morning, Robert's fever broke and then returned. He laughed and he cursed, and he ate spiced boar until he could not keep it down. On the fourth day, he sent for John Aaron's old maester's ledgers and leafed through them with a sudden hungry seriousness that filled Eddard with a chill unconnected to the draft snaking under the window. I should have listened, Robert said. I should have listened when he talked of seed and fruit and black hair and gold. He snorted, and then grimaced and put a hand to his side. I should have listened to many things. You are listening now, Ned told him. Too late, Robert said with a grin that went crooked as pain bit him. The gods have always given me the right answer just after I've done the wrong thing. Makes for a lively life. He grew weaker as ravens flew. Jon reached Winterfell in 6 days with Yoren and a ragged clutch of boys bound for recruit. Lean, hungry faces, a black-haired armorer's apprentice with wary blue eyes who scowled at everything, a thick-set lad who laughed like thunder, a weasel-faced boy who said little and watched much. Winterfell rose out of the earth like it had grown there, gray-green, its towers worn smooth by wind and hands both. The gods would breathe when Jon stepped beneath its leaves. He felt the eyes of the heart tree and thought of oaths he had nearly sworn. Catelyn stood at the edge of the yard when he came through the gate. She had a shawl around her shoulders, though it was summer. The wind found her anyway. Her hands were white where they gripped the wool. She regarded Jon as one might regard a ship that had slid its moorings and come drifting toward shore, unasked and heavy with men you did not know whether to welcome or refuse. "Mother," Robb said, stepping forward. His hair had grown. He looked older in a way that had nothing to do with the length of his limbs. He embraced Jon, and the thump of their chests eased something in each of them neither had known was knotted. "Your Grace," Maester Luwin said when he had been told all he must be told, and bowed with careful gravity that did not touch his eyes. "Forgive me, my tongue outran my sense." "Jon, say nothing that cannot be unsaid," Jon said, and smiled to make the words less stern. He didn't know he could smile that way until he heard himself do it. "I do not know how to be any grace at all just yet." "You will learn," Luwin said, making it both hope and warning. Catelyn inclined her head, the smallest measure polite with strangers. "We are commanded to send you south," she said. Her voice held a note like a string drawn tight enough to break, but it did not. "The king's word is not a thing Winterfell ignores." "I did not know," Jon said quietly, "that the king thought." She watched his face. "He thinks as men who have had too much drink think," she said. "He thinks like a man who never bore and never feared the cost of bearing." She folded her hands together and looked at them so fiercely it seemed they might blush. "I will not lie to you. I do not rejoice. But you are Eddard Stark's son." Her eyes snapped back to his, blue and colder than the heart trees. "Remember where you learned honor. Remember in whose halls you learned the meaning of words." "I will remember," Jon said, and found the words came from some place deeper than courtesy. He sat with Bran in the warm, dark hush of the bedchamber and told him stories of the wall that the boy drank like a thirsty man drinks water. "You will go back?" Bran asked, when breath had slowed and sleep seemed to drowse in the rafters. "I do not know," Jon said, and it was the first time he had admitted that aloud to himself or any other. Ghost lay at the foot of the bed, eyes half-lidded, the picture of peace, and yet Jon knew with a wolf knowing that his sleep was a mask for listening. "There are duties everywhere." "Father will know," Bran said, with the fearlessness of children's faith. Jon said. "He will." Arya ambushed him in the yard and hit him in the chest with such force he took a step backward or risked breaking her nose. She smelled of horse and sweat and the river. "You can't be king," she declared, muffled against his cloak. "Joffrey will cut your head. He always wants heads." "Joffrey will cut his own hand off by mistake," Jon said, and she snorted, a wet laugh, and wiped her nose on his sleeve as she had always done. Sansa stood at the far end of the yard and watched him with a posture so careful, he had to look away to keep from wanting to rescue her from her own spine. She came and curtsied and said words that were right in the mouth and wrong everywhere else. He did not reach to touch her cheek because he thought she might shatter. Will you wear a crown?" she asked in a very small voice, as if she were asking if he might put a silly hat on for a jape. "If I must," he said. "And," she faltered, "Joffrey," he did not let her wander into that dark alone, "is no son of the king," he said more gently than the truth deserved. "You will not wed him. I am sorry if that grieves you." Sansa's lashes fluttered like moth wings. "I am glad," she said, with a dignity so new it gleamed. "I think I am glad." They left Winterfell with Hallis Malin and a dozen good men riding guard. Jon looked back only once at the great grey keep and the Godswood's canopy and the smoking baths and the ravens turning like bits of scorched paper in the wind. Ghost did not look back. The road took them south. The summer heat settled and grew heavier. They saw Lannister men on the road once, a tight hard knot of riders with red cloaks and hard faces, and avoided them by taking a goat path through a wood of birches that trembled like girls in a draft. They met a tinker who had words to sell along with his riddles. A story of a woman birthing twins with one black and one gold. A tale of a septon-driven drunk with bees in his beard. A king's naming. "Jon Baratheon," the tinker said fondly. "Has a ring to it, don't it? Small folk like to think a man can be raised up to be high, and high men brought low to keep them company. In King's Landing, the king took to his bed. The fever ate and returned what it wanted. On a bright afternoon when the smell of the sea came sweet and strong up the hill, Robert held Eddard's hand and said, in a voice like a boy's that had run too long and only now thought to be winded, 'I should have given you a crown, you stubborn bastard. You would have hated it, and it would have been better for it.' 'I will not wear it,' Ned said, because there were some lines that could never be anything but true. Robert smiled. 'You are a good man. That is your tragedy.' He looked past Ned as if the corner of the chamber had become a place he had known once and only now recognized. 'Tell the boy, tell my son when he comes. Tell him not to let them make him love it. The chair. It is knives, Ned. It will cut him. Tell him to hunt when he can, to laugh, to take less than he wants and be grateful. Gods, I am tired.' He slept. He did not wake. The bells tolled again, and this time there was no disguise in their mourning. Cersei did not weep where anyone could see. She knelt before the bier and sat beside it and looked into the old red face that had laughed and roared and kissed too many tavern girls and tried to be a king. Her anger fell silent there. It did not leave. Considered. Eddard stood at the head of the bier with Ser Barristan and felt a great loneliness press upon him like snow erasing tracks. The city shifted in its sleep. Men whispered to other men in the shadow of walls and agreed to things that would make their grandsons curse their names 2 generations hence. Varys breathed and the candles guttered. Littlefinger smiled. Janos Slint counted coin and weighed treachery against opportunity and found them identical. On the second day after the king's death, Eddard called the small council to the Solar and told them plain, Joffrey would not sit the Iron Throne. The child was a Lannister, and the law had been made as clear as it could be made. He read the royal decree legitimizing Jon and naming him heir, and he held up the seals again and again until even Pycelle's old eyes could not pretend not to see. Cersei did not attend. Jaime did not attend. The council, stripped of its gold and its lion for 1 hour, said the things frightened men say. "We must be careful," Lord Baelish said in that silken, reasonable way. "The city is a tinderbox. If you set a spark down the wrong alley, it will run and jump and lick and bring the walls down before any of us can reach water. The Lannisters have half the gold in the realm and all the men they can hire. Ser Jaime holds sway in the halls the way a bright sword holds sway in a dark room. The people will riot if you take away a princeling to whom they have already sewn banners. The people will riot if food grows scarcer and siege comes to the gates." Varys murmured. "The Lord of Casterly Rock grows impatient in the west and has let his dogs sniff far beyond their leashes. I have it on good authority that flax has been harvested in the riverlands with torches." His hands fluttered. And Lord Stannis has sent letters, so many letters. To whom? To everyone. He spells incest better than any man I know. Renley has fled. Renly's chair observed with perfect calm. It looked dazed to be empty. We do not choose between fires, Eddard said. We choose water and carry it up the hill until the flames are gone, and then we choose who struck the first spark and take his hands for it. The lawful heir is the lawful heir. We will hold the city, and we will crown Jon when he comes. That will be the end of it. Littlefinger's smile cut cleanly. If only ends obeyed orders. When Jon crossed the trident, a heron rose white from the reeds as if a ghost had startled to life. Hallis Malin rode close, his eyes always on the line of distant hedge or hill. Is it true, M-Lord? He asked after a long stretch in which their horses' hoofbeats were the only conversation. That the king died laughing? He died tired, Jon said. He did not say of what. He had read Ned's letter in Winterfell and then again camped by a stream under trees that leaned together like old women conspiring. The ink had blurred where a drop of rain had fallen. He had not wept. The grief sat very large inside him and took up so much room he could not find where to poke it to make it cry. They came upon a village burned to the bone. Sheep lay in the ashes, curled into themselves. A girl with half her hair singed sat on a stone and rocked and did not look at them. Ghost went ahead of them, weaving through smoke, and came back with his muzzle gray. Jon dismounted and put his hand on the girl's shoulder. She flinched but did not look up. Who did this? He asked. Men in a lion's cloak, she said, as if reciting a thing someone had told her rather than answering him. They asked for Lord Beric. We did not have him. They took our bread and our salt and my brother's feet. She looked up then, and he saw that her eyes had gone that peculiar color grief sometimes made. A washed-out blue, a memory of blue. Are you a lord? I am Jon, he said. It was the truest thing he could offer. We will see you safe to the next village. There was a child who would not stop crying. Jon took him and carried him on the saddle before him for a mile until the boy hiccuped and fell quiet. He did not know if such small acts mattered in the measure of a realm. Ghost trotted with his ears pricked. The men said little and looked often behind. On the last rise before King's Landing, the city spread beneath them like an old woman's workbox, a jumble of bright things and tangles of thread. The wall ran stony along her skirts. The red keep rose on the tallest hill like a clenched fist stained pink. The sea glittered and smelled of salt and old wood and fish. Jon felt the wolf in him pace and go still. He thought of Robert saying, through Ned's hand, do not let them make you love it. He rode in through the lion gate and heard the murmur pass like a wind that finds only one leaf and sets it shivering. The boy, the bastard, the king-turned-prince walking with a white wolf at his knee. Hands reached as they always do for new kings, to bless, to beg, to see if the flesh is real and transforms the toucher. Jon touched some. He looked into faces as if he could memorize them and send them back out to their lives changed in the only way that mattered, seen. In the throne room, the swords drank, as always. Eddard stood at the foot of the steps. Ser Barristan was to his right, faceless behind the steel of duty. Varys smiled like a candle about to gutter. Littlefinger drifted, the smell of mint close around him. Cersei was not there. Joffrey was not there. Myrcella and Tommen were not there. Jon mounted the steps as if he were entering a godswood, and the tree there watched him with disinterest so old it was almost kindness.
Ned knelt.
Others followed. Jon took a step back, startled, as if the crowd had lunged toward him. Do not, he said. Please, get up. His voice sounded too young in the vaulted air and too old in his own ears. Your Grace, Eddard said. And when he raised his head, his eyes were wet, and he did not care who saw. He took Jon by the arms and held him a moment, then released him. You look like yourself. I look like trouble, Jon said, and managed a smile that made the corner of Ned's mouth twitch. I am told I must be crowned. You will be anointed, Ned said. You will be named before gods and men. The crown, we will place it upon your head if you can bear it. Jon looked up at the Iron Throne and felt a damp, cold breeze that surely did not exist. He thought of Longclaw, a blade he had never held, and of the way steel and duty felt alike in the hand until they bit. He nodded. The High Septon's hands were soft and cool. The oil smelled of myrrh and crushed leaves and some spice Jon could not name. Prayers rolled and rolled like waves against a ship's hull. He spoke vows he heard as he said them, ancient things that spoke of keeping the peace and guarding the poor and taking counsel and remembering that kings are made from the grace of others and not the other way round. Eddard placed the crown upon his hair. It was heavy. Jon's neck complained. The antlers curved, dangerous as truth. He kept his head straight and looked at the hall he was meant to hold together by will and grace and the little he knew of kindness. "Rise, Jon of House Baratheon," the High Septon intoned. "Rise and be called king." Jon rose in a stillness so deep the room seemed suspended on a breath. Ghost stood at the foot of the steps, head high, red eyes level. For a heartbeat Jon saw the wolf as the room must see him. Unnatural, frightful, beautiful. Then the room breathed again. Some cheered, some did not. Cersei entered just as the cheering began, like a blade slipping between an enemy's ribs when he turns to speak to a friend. She wore a lion at her shoulder and a smile that promised 1,000 nights without sleep. She curtsied. "Your Grace," she said, "may you live forever." "May none of us," Jon replied before he knew he would say it, and her eyes sharpened a fraction, and a few men laughed who would later pretend they had not. They held a feast because that is what courts know how to do when they have no other answers to hand. Laughter pinged off pillars. Musicians sawed songs into bleeding strips and served them. Jon ate little and drank less and watched faces. Lord Rosby coughing discreetly into a napkin that came away red. Ser Mandon chewing the air with his mouth when he thought no one looked. Lord Baelish tossing a cherry into his mouth and catching the stem between tongue and teeth as if it were the conclusion of a trick. He spoke briefly with Tommen, who had been allowed to attend in the custody of a septa and 2 white cloaks. Myrcella curtsied again and asked, with grave 8-year-old courage, whether Ghost liked lemon cakes. "He eats meat," Jon said. "I am sorry." Myrcella nodded as if this were tragic but expected, as the world so often is. That night, Eddard brought him not to the Tower of the Hand but to the Godswood. The southern Godswood was cultivated for pretty, the pool was inned in white stone and the trees leaned with an artist's care. Yet the weirwood there had a face, and its eyes oozed slow red. It watched as old gods do without comment. "I lied," Ned said as they stood beneath its leaves. The words came like a man finishing a long climb and putting his hands upon the last stone. "Once, to keep you alive, to keep a promise that should never have been asked. I lied and said you were mine by some tavern girl with hair like midnight. I let you take the shame that belonged elsewhere. For that I will beg your pardon on my knees and thank you if you never forgive me." Jon looked at him steadily. "You have kept me," he said. "That is the truth that matters. The rest is gristle to be chewed when there is no meat." Ned huffed a laugh that turned at the end into something like a sob. "You have your mothers," he stopped. "There are truths yet that would cut the realm in half. Robert has given you one shield. I will give you another, if I must, or break upon it. Know this. I would have kept you safe in any weather." "I know," Jon said. He did, in that moment, with the certainty that certain knowledge gives. Like the chill of winter, like the taste of blood if you bite your tongue. A raven arrived from Dragonstone the next dawn. It bore the Baratheon seal in black wax and Stannis's angular hand beneath. A challenge written in iron filings. Stannis did not accept the king's naming. Stannis would come and take what law and right declared his. He wrote of incest. He wrote of abhorrence. He wrote of proper order. "He is not wrong," Ned said, very quiet. His honesty was a blade he never set fully down. "He is not wholly right," Jon said, and stared long at the paper until the letters crawled. "He is Stannis." Which is to say, Peter Baelish drawled from the shadows of the council chamber when he was told that he can be neither bribed nor charmed and will go on making his point long after anyone who might have been persuaded has died of boredom. Varys's lashes lowered and lifted as if he had just thought of something that gave him pleasure. "He has a new priestess," he murmured, "red as a bride's blush and twice as warm. She speaks of a god of fire and the doom of darkness and has taught Lord Stannis to see portents in his hearth." He laced his fingers. "I am always wary of men who begin to see things in the fire. Stannis will come by sea," Ser Barristan judged. "Renley will come by road if he comes. Lord Tywin will come by any way that costs others more than it costs him. Then we will meet them as kings should meet," Jon said. He felt very young saying it and very old saying it, and understood, for an instant, that the crown had already begun to press lines into his face he would carry until he died. "We will not starve the city waiting. We will not burn it to keep it warm. We will meet them as men, and if the gods are kind, we will part as men." The first blow came not from sea or road but from within. Janos Slynt sold the city watch a second time, this time to anyone with gold and a lion stamped on it. He had not learned subtlety. He had learned only reward. At dusk 100 cloaks turned in unison as if a wind had struck them, and steel hissed. Eddard had sent men to all the gates. Ser Barristan had put white swords where white swords should be, and when the gold cloaks surged for the Tower of the Hand, they met northern steel and fell back into their own dead. Janos ran and did not run far enough. They took him in a wine sink near the Street of Silk, and he wept ironically enough into the lap of a woman dressed like a lioness. Cersei's chamber was emptied and then filled again with a calmer version of fury. She paced. She wrote letters now that she sent to her father again, to her father until the ink dried and the sand stuck to the shape of the words. Jaime grew wild and careful at once. Joffrey sulked as only boys denied a toy can sulk. Myrcella watched everything and said little. Tommen cried and then became ashamed of having cried and cried more for that. In the west, Tywin Lannister sharpened his war upon the Riverlands until the rivers ran thin as if drained and left to dry. In the south, Renly put a crown of flowers among real antlers and let Marjorie Tyrell place it on his hair. And men cheered because they loved pageantry and because a smiling king feels like a soft bed after a hard journey. On Dragonstone, Stannis' ships crowded harbor, and firelight glimmered in windows where there should have been only the sea. Davos watched the Red Woman's shadow lengthen even when the candle had burned low and said nothing that Stannis would hear. In the far north, beyond the wall, something moved. A man with blue eyes opened his mouth and made no sound at all. Jon sat in the Tower of the Hand in a chair too soft and near a table too rich and listened to men talk about grain. "If we feed the city now," said a sharp-chinned steward with a voice like a quill, "we will have none for winter. If we feed it little, we will have none because the people will kill the carts and themselves and any man who touches a loaf. If we may be fed by the Reach." "The Reach is busy crowning flowers," Peter said gently. "We should have invited Lord Mace to supervise the kitchen. He would have been made for it." "Enough," Jon said mildly, because if he spoke with the first edge of his voice, he feared it would never grow dull again. "We will buy what we can. We will send to Duskendale and Driftmark. We will work the sea as a farmer works a poor field, harder, and with more prayer." "Prayer is seldom a plan," Varys murmured. "It is often what we have," Jon said, and surprised himself by smiling. At night, he walked the ramparts. Ghost ranged invisible until the moon caught him and made him a vision men cross themselves to see. Jon put a hand upon warm stone and watched the city breathe and thought of the sound the wall made in winter. He thought of his talk with Maester Aemon, the old man's clouded eyes and the clarity of his voice. "What is honor?" Aemon had asked him then, as wind knifed them. "Compared to a woman's love, what is duty against the feel of a newborn skin in a father's arms? Or a brother's smile?" The questions had been leaves. Now he felt for the branches beneath. "Love is the death of duty," Aemon had said. But then, had he not also said that duty is the death of love? He did not know the answer. He had only the wind and the feel of stone and the knowledge that the crown sat upon him even when he slept. They met Stannis' fleet off the gullet long before it dared the Blackwater, because Davos Seaworth had sent a boat under a flag of peace with a letter in a plain hand that said, "Meet me and speak once, before we are enemies that cannot be mended. Jon rode out with Ser Barristan and 2 other white cloaks because there are moments a king must be seen upon the water if he hopes to rule men who fish. The sea went from gray to green to black and back to gray. Stannis's flagship rose out of the mist like a rock. On the high deck stood Stannis, thin, severe, his mouth an unpracticed thing that could not make smiles without splitting. Beside him stood Davos, whose face had been shaped by sun and wind and honest trouble. Between them burned a brazier, although the day was warm. The Red Woman leaned near it and looked at Jon as if she were reading a book whose ending she already knew. "You wear it ill," Stannis said in greeting instead of greeting. "It sits ill," Jon agreed. "I am told that is the point. Points are for spears," Stannis returned, and something like contempt made his mouth twist. "You wear a thief's prize. You know this." "I wear what was given me by a dying king who had the right to give it," Jon said. "I do not ask you to like it. I ask what you want." "Justice," Stannis said at once, like a man whose thirst is so constant he has forgotten it is thirst. "Obedience. An end to this charade." Jon looked past him for a moment at the ships, sleek things ready to be cruel. He thought of the city's walls, of the fattest bellies in Flea Bottom, of Sansa's hands shaking as she threaded a needle because doing something settled her. He thought of the girl on the stone and the sheep like knots of ash and of the loneliness in Ned's eyes when he had said I lied. He thought of Ghost and of something old Bear Mormont had said as he'd knelt his head to scratch the wolf's ear. "That winter makes beggars of us all. If the law were a feast we could set in the hall," Jon said, "I would give you the best plate and take the bone, and then we would both go away satisfied with having eaten. But the law is not a feast. It is a map drawn long ago by men who did not see the bog that has swallowed half the road, and so we must choose where to wade." He took a breath. "There is a war in the west. Tywin Lannister burns the Riverlands and laughs as he does it. There is a hunger in the city. There will be another war if you set siege and Renley marches up the Rosby Road putting flowers in his hair. And there is winter. The Red God burns winter," Melisandre said, her voice soft and hot at once. "In the light all darkness dies." "In the light," Davos said, and looked down at his hands as if searching for the missing bones there that would show him this truth. "You can see how far the ground is yet to walk. Leave this to men," Stannis snapped, his gaze knifed to Jon. "Yield." "No," Jon said, not harshly. He saw Stannis flinch anyway, and was surprised by the pity in himself. "But hear me, the wall needs men. Send me ships and I will send you grain. When the others come, if the tales are true and the dead walk with eyes of ice, your God and mine and everyone's will be too busy with prayers to bake bread. The realm needs peace more than it needs men counting which rule is the prettiest. I offer you a seat on my council and the safety of Dragonstone under your rule, as has been the custom for heirs. If the realm calls a great council when the snow recedes and decides I am too poor a king to keep, I will bow to it." Stannis made a sound like a man who had swallowed a stone and found that it stuck near the heart. "You would let them strip you of what you did not deserve to put on? I would let them choose if they will die for that choice," Jon said. "And if they will live in it." Melisandre's red mouth curved. "He is interesting," she murmured. "The fire loves a man who thinks he will not burn." Davos's eyes warmed by a degree. Stannis's did not. He gripped the rail until his knuckles went white. "I will send you no ships," he said. "I will not bend the knee. I will not sit on your council. I will come when the wind suits, and I will take what is mine. Then we will meet you at the river mouth," Ser Barristan said, as if he were reciting the day's chores rather than planning slaughter. Jon nodded, and the moment became simple. He bowed to Stannis with a courtesy that acknowledged that they were both men and would die as all men do, in the end beyond law and beyond pride. "Then come," he said. They parted on the water. The sea closed behind like a seam sewn with a slow needle. Jon sat long in the small boat, watching the wake, and thought that if he were a man given to prayer, he would ask that the gods make him dull. Not stupid, only enough like stone that the blows might spend themselves on him without breaking what lay beneath. He did not pray. He touched Ghost's head and felt the living heat there. War came as it always does, creeping in at the edges of decision until there was nothing left to choose. Stannis tested the river once in a feint. Renly's green banners appeared on the horizon like a garden walking. Tywin's outriders sniffed at the gold road and found their noses bloodied by a commander Jon did not know he would love. Bronn, a Sellsword with a grin that held no pity and a kind of strange fairness. The city held. Ghost took a wound above the eye and did not whimper. Jon bound it with his own hands and felt the wolf's breath on his knuckles and understood that love is sometimes obligation dressed as tenderness and sometimes tenderness dressed as obligation and very seldom purely one. Sansa stood on the roof and watched fires far away and did not cry. Arya slipped like a weasel through the kitchens and learned 3 words in the tongues of 3 different cooks that meant the same thing and were all insults for the same man. Cersei played Syvass with herself and set the king's dragon in places the rules did not allow and then laughed when no one came to scold her. Night fell and rose and fell again. Letters came broken and blood-spattered. The small folk told a tale about a white wolf that ran through Flea Bottom at midnight robbing cruel men of their shadows. There were fewer beatings for a time, and then they came back, as all things do. One night Jon woke to the cold certainty that he had been hearing a sound in his sleep and only now knew it. Ravens, many ravens, a black river of their voices. He rose and then ran. The rookery was a storm of wings. A single, bent-backed man stood in the chaos like a pillar. Maester Aemon, far from the wall, far from the tower where Jon had thought he would grow old. He turned his blind eyes when Jon entered, as if he could see better the less there was to see. "We meet again," Aemon said mildly as ravens tore the air around him into smaller and smaller pieces. "I did not know you had come," Jon said, baffled and glad in a way he could not name. "How?" "I wrote," Aemon said with a small smile. "Men may not read old words. I walked. Men do not watch old men. I was carried when I must be. I was brought by those who yet remember how to feel the shape of winter in their bones." His hand found Jon's sleeve, light as ash. "And I have brought news that is older than war and newer than tomorrow." The scroll was stiff and cold to the touch. The black wax had set with a thumbprint denting it. Jeor Mormont's hand made its way across the page like a man crossing ice that moaned beneath him. Dead things in the woods, cold things in the night, whispers that moved more than leaves. The old bear had written sparely and without fear. He asked for men. He asked for steel. He asked for any king who would call himself such to remember that walls only hold when they are held. Jon sat because his knees had ceased to be certain. He had known this thing would come. He had ached with the knowing. Yet there was a difference between knowing a winter will come and feeling the first snow on your face. "Send," he said to Ned when he brought the words, and his voice was hoarse with urgency that was not fear and not love but of their family. "Send now. Half our plans must wait." "Half our plans were always lies to comfort ourselves," Ned said, which would have sounded like despair in another man and sounded like hope in him because he had the habit of setting his shoulder to a work until it moved. "We will send. We will send now." He called the banners, but differently than any king had called them in memory. Not to war against a neighbor, to the wall. The letters went, and some men laughed, and some men remembered tales their grandmothers had told, and some men felt their bones and said yes, and some said nothing until the day's first frost made their breath visible and made their wives say perhaps you might consider. The riverlands bled. The reach fluttered. The stormlands fought themselves in mirrors. The ironborn stirred with the smell of opportunity on the wind. The north began to move. Stannis came to the mouth of the Blackwater with fire painted on his sails and found not wildfire but nets and chains and a city that had decided it would not burn itself to prove a point. He tested and was tested and withdrew with ships too few and anger too sharp for any healing, even if he had wanted healing, and he did not. Renly looked toward the capital and saw no easy pageant to love. He turned his army toward the west where a lion's roar could be made to quiet well enough with roses stuffed in its mouth. Tywin maneuvered, and for once the board did not settle entirely to his liking, because too many pieces had minds of their own and did not leap obediently. In the Godswood, under leaves that shivered like whispers, Jon stood with his hands open and asked the old gods for something he did not ask of the Seven or the Red God or the new and lightning-bright gods men in the city invented every drought. He asked to be kept honest. He asked not to be spared. He asked for winter to come in the open where men could see it and not eat at their feet in the night. Ghost pressed his shoulder, warm and present and neither future nor past. Jon thought of a woman with tears drying on her cheek and a word in his ear that had made a life. When the first winter storm blew into King's Landing while the roses still struggled along walls where the sun hit bravely, old women cackled in satisfaction that had nothing to do with malice. They had told them so. Snow fell thin as flour and did not stick. Children stuck out their tongues anyway and tasted a thing they had only heard of. Men looked at the sky and felt a brief, curious fear. That night, Jon dreamed he stood atop the wall with a crown of antlers on his head and a sword in his hand that was not Longclaw and not ice and not anything he had a name for. The wind tore at him. Far in the darkness, blue eyes opened like two lamps in storm. He woke with a hand on Ghost and his heart measured out in beats. Letters came from the north and the Vale and the Neck, from men whose names Jon had known as pieces on a map and now learned as hands pressed to his in corridors. They brought with them promises, and bread, and stubbornness, and fear. They brought also a story that wandered like all stories until it found a place to curl. That there had been a king once who had known he would die and chose not his brother nor his son nor his wife's son, but a boy who had been no one. People told that story to one another in the bakeries and the brothels and the shadow of the Red Keep where the stones sweated, and they asked, "What kind of king is that?" In the asking was a kind of answer. The city did not love Jon and did not hate him, which is perhaps the truest peace a king can hope for. They watched him walk with a white wolf at his knee and said, "That is the king who listens," or "That is the king who says no and does not shout it," or "That is the king who asks for taxes and looks sorry." Some said he was a Stark, and some said he was a Baratheon, and some said he was a boy, and some said it did not matter because winter was coming and any warm hand was welcome. Eddard stood with him at sunset one evening as the sky burned itself down to embers over the bay. "We will do many things wrong," he said. "I will. You will. We will bury many dead. We will build walls and see them fall. We will speak truth and be called liars and lie and be called wise. Keep to the smallest truths when the great ones will not hold. That has been my way." "That has been your honor," Jon said. "It has been my survival," Ned said wryly. "And sometimes others." Jon laughed, surprised by it, then sobered. "I do not know if we can keep the North and the South from tearing one another apart while we ask them to remember the wall." "Remind them," Ned said. "Again and again, until the words where grooves their grandchildren's grandchildren can put their feet into to climb out of some other pit the world will dig." A wind came off the water. It smelled of salt and cold and far things. Krakens sleeping, islands counting their coins, storms not yet born. Jon set his hand upon the parapet and found it had warmed beneath his palm. Far away, horn sounded long and low, and if it were only a ship, for a moment it was also a memory of another horn. He breathed. "Your Grace," Ser Barristan said from the door in his even, careful way, "the envoy from White Harbor waits." "Let him wait another 10 breaths, Jon said, and looked at the sky until those breaths had come and gone and the first star pricked through. "Now let us go and speak of ships and bread. There will be time yet to speak of ghosts." They went down together, king in hand, into the friendly dark where men and women gathered to press their hopes like coins into hands that might return them doubled. The wolf trotted soundless and without fear. Somewhere beyond Storm's End, Renley laughed for the 500th time in the day and told a story about a stag who learned to dance. Somewhere on Dragonstone, Stannis sharpened his resolve like a knife on a stone that never wore smooth. In the west, Tywin Lannister counted costs, and in the far north, where the sky pressed low and the snow learned to speak, a line of men in black stumbled one step, and then another, holding a wall that would not hold itself. In King's Landing, a boy who had been given a name greater than his life sat at a table scattered with maps and breadcrumbs and bent back his head and felt the crown shift, just a little. It did not fall. He took up his quill. He wrote, "To the Lord Commander of the Night's Watch, with all the haste a king can conjure, And then, because the letter would be carried by a man and read by a man and lives might rest upon how the words felt in the mouth, he crossed out king and wrote simply, "I ask this of you as Jon." When the snow finally came to stay, it came first in a quiet night that turned the red keep stones gray with a softness they had not known in 100 years. In the morning, the steps to the great September were dusted white. Children skidded and fell and laughed as if the world had invented laughter for them. Jon watched from a window and smiled. He thought of the heart tree in Winterfell and imagined it wearing this same white shawl. He thought of a promise in a bloody bed and a king who had loved too much in the wrong directions and found at last one right thing to love and give away. He thought of blue eyes opening in the dark. He turned from the window toward a day full of men and bread and letters and too much steel and said, to no one and to everyone, "Let us begin." They brought the envoy from White Harbor into the solar with the smell of the sea still clinging to his cloak. Salt taped the cuffs and dried white across the leather, and a bit of weed had hitched itself in the hem and refused to be picked out by the servant's nervous fingers. He bowed to Jon without flourish, as a man who has bent his back to honest work does it. When he straightened, his eyes were small in a large, ruddy face, and they filled the room with a fisher's directness. "I am Ser Marlon Manderly, your grace," he said, the word catching on his tongue not with doubt but with the care of a man setting a precious thing on a shelf. "My lord grandfather sends me with ships, terms, and respect." Wyman Manderly's seal was a leviathan fat as the man who stamped it. Ned had already broken the wax and read the letter twice before the envoy came up the hill. Jon took it now and let the old knight's voice roll silent beneath his eyes. Fealty to the king named by a king, support for the wall that kept White Harbor's nets safe from worse than storms, grain by the hullful if a king could promise coin and protection for the ships that sailed for Eastwatch by the sea. A post for the north in the counting of coin might not be refused. "We can protect them," Jon said, looking up. The window let the autumn light pour over Ser Marlon's shoulders and silver his hair. "We mean to escort all ships bound for Eastwatch from Driftmark to the Bight. Valerian oars will do if your sails give out. I will put it in writing, and the coin will be counted." He slanted a look at Peter Baelish where he drifted pale as mint smoke by the hearth. "By hands even a White Harbor man can trust." Littlefinger's smile stitched itself small. "Trust is such a pious word," he murmured. "We all make our offerings to it and then slip through the nave to steal a candle. We can give more than coin," Ned said, the map of the north already unfurling in his mind. Lines he knew by the feel of the terrain under his horse's hooves more than by ink. "What the Manderleys carry north can be guarded south. We will proclaim that any hand that dares molest a ship flying the King's Seal or White Harbor's is forfeit. We will enforce it. That is worth coin to a man who sleeps in a bunk that smells of fish and fear," Ser Marlon said simply. "And the grain," he hesitated. "We have enough for our own. We have more. But we cannot empty our granaries for a south that forgets us when it is fat. My lord would have a voice on your small council. Not his own, he is too old and too fond of pies. A Manderly voice. Names?" Jon asked. "Ser Marlon," Ned said, already knowing, and saw the way the old knight's mouth flew open and tried to close without showing any teeth. "If you will be so put upon." "I can count," Ser Marlon muttered. "I can count better than men think, and I have learned the price of flour by buying it for wives who looked at me as if my hands were empty. I will take the chair and the sneers." "Good," Jon said. "Then let us start with numbers. How many ships on your first tide?" 8 cogs, 3 galleys," Marlon said without looking to the letter. 6 laden with rye, 2 with oats, 1 with salted fish for the wall, and 1 with wool, hides, and men who have bellies and arms and want work where the wind sings differently. "We'll send a levy of carpenters to Eastwatch," Ned added. "Let the watch keep them and pay them in bread and honest shelter, if we keep them alive to collect. You'll have the King's Road posted with his decree," he told Peter. "No taxes on food on northbound carts. Cut the throats of any who try. That does ruin so many small ambitions," Littlefinger said, languid as a cat who has found all the warm places. "Very well," when Ser Marlin had been seen to meet in a room that did not look like any room at White Harbor. Jon sat with Ned and Varys as candles were brought and the light darkened to gold. The eunuch's hands rested like folded birds upon his belly. "This is well," he said softly. "Every ship that noses north carries with it a piece of the throne you sit on. Men seldom burn their own roofs unless drunk or very sure of rebuilding on their neighbor's land. The Tyrells build," Ned said, "with roses and order and good roads. They are builders and eaters and singers, and all that turns to soldiers neatly when a man with a green cloak tells them where to stand. If Renley makes the Reach his garden, he will march sooner than we are ready to give him a reason not to." Varys inclined his head. "Lady Olenna writes to her friends with an old woman's hand that trembles only when she chooses. She speaks of the foolishness of boys and the value of girls who can become queens." Jon looked at his own hand where the crown had pressed a faint bruise into the skin of his brow and thought how strange it was that love and hunger and power all looked like faces at a feast, and a man could only talk to one at a time. "We cannot marry every trouble quiet," he said. "No," Varys agreed, "but sometimes a bride is a well-laid road." Before the week was out, Jaime Lannister proved himself again the best of the Lannisters at turning beauty into a blade. The attempt came with as much grace as violence could wear. They struck at the hour when the kitchens were busiest and the gold cloaks on the west stairs were thinking more about a pot of stew than about the step between them and the men with steel. A Lannister man in the red and gold of Casterly Rock strode into the antechamber outside the nursery with a pair of casks and an easy grin that had sold him goods from stocks to lads, and that morning would have bought him passage if not for a white cloak's habit of counting as priests count candles. "Wine!" Ser Aerys Oakheart's voice had no music. "Who sent you?" "Lord Baelish," the man said without blinking, "to toast the peace." Ser Aerys touched the cask with a gloved finger and examined the wet that clung. "It is a poor wine that turns a man's lips blue," he said almost sadly, and the sword came into his hand as if that was its place and not its scabbard. Jaime came behind the wine, sort of courtesy, sort of insult. He moved like a thought men prefer not to have, quick and gleaming. Ser Barristan met him on the stair. For a heartbeat the hall grew hushed as a god's ear. They were both fine as drawn wire, both old in ways their faces had not caught up to, both proud, both burdened by promises. Steel kissed and bit. Jaime laughed once when their blades locked and their faces were too close for politeness. "At last," he breathed. "Something honest." "Always," Barristan returned and twisted. Jaime's wrist turned with it, clever, and they parted. They might have killed one another there, in an old palace between an old man's empty nursery and a queen's temper, if the hound had not stepped between at an oblique angle like a man shouldering open a drunken tavern door. "Enough," Sandor Clegane growled. His hair smelled of horse. His eyes had the flat yellow of a dog's in firelight. He put one big boot against a red-cloaked hip and shoved, and then planted himself shoulder to shoulder with Barristan, and for a moment the hall held a picture. The white and the rough, the heroes of ballads and men only girls loved until they grew old enough to be women. "Go," Sandor said to the wet-eyed boy who peeked from behind the nursery door. "Back. This is not for you." Tommen obeyed, sniffling, brave as a boy is brave when he has no choice. Jaime fainted and found himself with a nick at his wrist and an oath at his tongue. He stepped back, suddenly weary in a way the lines at the corner of his eyes knew. "Very well," he said through his teeth to Ser Barristan. "The game is postponed." "Not for long," Cersei told him as she pulled him bodily away by his sleeve with a strength that came of not allowing herself to feel how her hands shook. Her eyes had a green glassy calm. "We are not playing." That night she burned a letter to her father and wrote another. She gathered jewels and found she had set aside a ruby that had belonged to a king's mistress once, and she laughed abruptly and loud. She tried to sleep and dreamed of a white wolf sitting beside the throne and looking at her with the patient disdain of a thing that knows while you are still guessing. She woke with a hand at her throat. The court tightened like a fist around its own beating. Men started down corridors and found them unexpectedly watched. Candles were snuffed and then lit again by hands that had been told precisely which hour to do it and had repeated the instruction back. And yet, Ned Stark slept 4 hours and then 3 and then sometimes 2 and found even that enough because his mind knew the work it had to return to. Jon learned the names of guards on the Mudgate and the wives of the men who peddled fish under the dragon's tail, and the way the cobbles sloped where carts spilled more easily, and how the wind tunneled up the street of flour into the old broken teeth of Visenya's hill. He learned where King's Landing hurt when winter breathed. When he wrote to the wall, he set his pen to say men and ship, until his hand ached and the ache steadied him. Word of Renly's court in bittersweet splendor drifted up the Rosby Road before Renly himself did. A pavilion that bloomed like summer at its center with a flower-haired lady in gauze and a boy king with a green mantle who made even old men laugh against their better judgment. Lords came to be warmed by his gaze and to bask in the wit that Loras Tyrell flashed like a polished spur. Tents multiplied and a town of banners sprang on the long grass like mushrooms after rain. The cooks called the place Honey Tent. The men called it Field of Flowers. Couriers called it a logjam with a band. Renly, not above hearing names for things and making himself their meaning, called it a court. He also called for a parley. Ned would have gone if Jon had not insisted. They argued in the way men argue who have long since stopped pretending they do not care deeply for the other's safety. "You are the king," Ned said, as if the bare word was not the most ridiculous piece of armor to wear into a tent full of opinions. "Kings do not go where a single arrow might sift 10 bulletins into the dust." "I have a white wolf," Jon said mildly. "You have a wolf," Ned said, "and a stubbornness that makes me want to box your ears as if you were 10. They went together, which was as much compromise as either of them would admit to. They chose a place east of the Rosby Road in a stand of poplars that made a shiver out of the afternoon. Renly came with a company of merry men and one woman whose broad-shouldered grace and lack of patience made her seem more solid than all the rest together. Mace Tyrell puffed and beamed. Lady Olenna, who was much smaller than any tale imagined her, sat on a folding chair with a bit of cheese and a kindness that had teeth. Loras leaned spoiled and dangerous at Renly's shoulder. They bowed enough to show that they could and no more. "Your Grace," Renly said to Jon with pleasure like good wine in his voice, "how I have longed for a pleasant conversation." "Then perhaps we begin with the thing that turns most conversations bitter," Jon said. "Thank you for coming. Grateful kings are my favorite kings," Lady Olenna observed as she set her cheese aside and applied herself to the shape of the young man's face. "They remember who lent them salt." "We remember salt," Ned said. "We remember who spilled it too." Marjorie Tyrell stepped forward then, because she understood that stages want a figure to fix on, and she wore the green that made her eyes brighter and the cut that made her look older by a carefully calculated year. She curtsied with her hands low and her chin high and smiled in a way that did not promise anything except the possibility of more such smiles. "Your Grace," she said to Jon, "my grandmother says what she will. I am told you do too. Perhaps we will like one another or at least not be bored." "I would be glad for either," Jon said honestly, and saw the corner of her mouth tilt as if he had handed her a new tool she had not asked for and found it fit her grip well. "We are at odds because there is only one chair for too many men. But there are more tables than chairs. Will you sit at mine?" Renly lifted his brows. "You ask a king to sit at your table like a favored captain." "I ask a man to sit like a man," Jon said. "You have many who love you. You have something that looks like happiness following you about, and the realm is in love with that because it is rare as a 3-headed calf and less likely to frighten the housemaids. But if we put your happy at the head of the board, Tywin will poison it. Stannis will put a knife through it for being too merry at supper. Winter will throw its cloak over it, and we will all forget we were laughing." Olenna pursed her lips and turned her head as if to taste the wind. "He talks," she said approvingly. "Not like a book, like a man. That can be worse in kings, but it can be better, too." Renly's smile lost its shine and found something almost sober. "You offer me what?" "A marriage," Jon said, "because a man who hopes to keep what is delicate must sometimes put it on the table first before others do with worse hands. To Lady Marjorie, a seat on my council for Lord Mace. Provision for your men. A command for Ser Loras where his courage can do more than win tourney purses. A great council. When the snow lifts, to say whether the realm wishes to keep me or crown a new story. He breathed. If they choose you with all eyes open, I will bend the knee. Loras made a sound involuntary and sharp enough to cut his own tongue. Renly's eyes widened with the delight a boy finds in a trick he did not expect from the quiet child 3 seats down. You dare greatly, he said. I have a wall to feed, Jon returned. I will dare what keeps bakers' ovens warm when boys come home cold. Marjorie watched him as a farmer in a new field watches a sky he does not yet know how to read. She glanced at her grandmother, and a look passed between them like a needle. And what do you want for this gift you offer? She asked. To be allowed to keep your people from starving and mine from freezing and the rest of the realm from cutting itself to pieces while we stand at the wall and count our dead, Jon said. And for you to put your hand in mine in front of all of them, so when they say it cannot be done, we can show them that it is being done and that they are late to the seeing. Lady Olenna clucked her tongue. My dear, if you do not marry this boy, I shall. And my bones will break in the bed, and it will be his fault. She fixed Jon with a gaze that would have made a younger man shift. Promise me you will not die this winter. It is an indecency in kings. So many of them do it, and the songs never mention the waste. I will do my best to be indecent only in other ways, Jon said. Renly laughed. He laughed joyfully, the way bells laugh in a high wind. Very well. We will take this to my pavilion and put names on parchment and pretend that names are stronger than pride. He lifted his chin at Ned. Can you stand a Tyrell wedding, my lord? There will be roses and good bread and a number of jokes you will not find funny. I have stood worse, Ned said. I have stood storms. Do not be solemn, it makes me sentimental, Renly told him, and clapped Jon on the shoulder with a warmth that might have been wholly true or wholly clever and would do as long as it served. The pact that grew from that afternoon had the look of a miracle and the feel of a bargain. The Reach would bring grain and men into the city and receive the king's favor and the promise that their queen would be the realms. Renly would withdraw to the west and turn his merry banners against lions in earnest, though he would keep his own crown upon his head until the Great Council was called because the Reach took off what it put on slowly and with a price. Jon would marry before winter settled enough to close roads. Loras would command in the field under the cool eye of Randyll Tarly, whose efficiency made men uncomfortable the way clean steel makes those who prefer dull knives angry. Oaths were taken. The air sweetened. Songwriters waxed their quills, knowing a story when it walked by in green gloves. And beyond Storm's End, on a night when the sea pressed itself against Dragonstone like a suitor, Stannis Baratheon dreamed of a shadow stepping out of his own and did not know whether he woke before or after it went to murder his brother in his bright tent. Renly died laughing. No one who told the tale later could agree what he had been laughing at. Some said a jest Loras had made. Some said a rude noise Lady Olenna pretended not to hear. Some said he had been laughing at his own handsome reflection when the candle guttered and went out and a thing like cold smoke slipped between the folds of the tent and put a hand around his throat and squeezed his life out as if it were a tarnished coin. Brienne of Tarth, who had been last to see him and first to cry out, was blamed by those who never liked her face, and Loras would have killed her for that if Queen of Thorns had not put the weight of all her smallness between them and said, very precisely, no. The camp broke like sugar under hot tea. Mace Tyrell barked orders that Loras ignored. The Tyrells had the look of cats who have been stung by bees. Their pride ran off like honey and left them sticky and furious. They did not run to Stannis. He was fire they would not warm their hands at now. They did not run to Tywin. He would have sheared their whiskers for sport. They turned, as all clever men and women do when the path they had chosen ends at a pit, to the nearest flat ground and the man there upon it with steady eyes and a promise that sounded like a plan. Jon met Marjorie again in a room empty of ornaments. She wore mourning like moss. It clung to her fairness and did not hide it. Her lashes were wet, but her jaw was set. I grieve for your brother, Jon said. He meant Renly. He also meant Loras, who sat in the next room staring at a cup and seeing a tent on fire inside it. I grieve for my house, she said, but grief is not the same as ruin. She lifted her chin. If I put on your crown, I will not take it off for any great council that listens to men who did not climb the hill. Do you still want me? Jon thought of vows with oil and steel and herbs and smoke. He thought of a girl with a wolfish laugh who was not a lady and had never been asked to be one. He thought of the wall and of bread. I want peace, he said. I will not leave the Tyrells in the cold. I will not leave the North hungry. If the council names me unfit, it must find a king and a queen who will do the work. She studied him a moment with a cool acuity that made him think of a small winter sun that does not warm but illuminates. You will not love me, she said. Perhaps I will, Jon answered, honest enough to make a wound. But I do not ask it. I ask your help. You shall have it, Marjorie said. She turned and touched the door where Loras sat beyond it with her fingertips, light as a prayer. And you shall have him, if he can be turned from revenge to worth. I can use a man who rides at the front and makes others braver, Jon said. I cannot use a man who kills my friends to avenge his dead. She smiled then, faintly. We are agreed. The city put on flowers and winter cloaks at once. Snow fell the morning of the formal betrothal and melted by noon and left the streets wet and shining for the procession. The small folk crowded the steps and the windows and the parapets and saw a pretty girl put her hand into a young king's and heard old vows redone and murmured, because they wanted to believe that when a man and a woman said such words, the world bent a little toward them and away from sharp things. Jon wore the crown and did not feel its weight lessen. Ned stood behind him and did not smile and did not frown and looked like a storm that has decided to rain slowly instead of tearing off roofs. Word of the betrothal reached Dragonstone like the hiss of oil tossed on coals. Stannis read the Raven's letter and did not crumple it. He set it down deliberately, as if setting down a child that would fall if not carefully placed. They wed our enemies to their belly, he said. They wed our enemies to our enemies, Davos returned. That is sometimes a way to keep both too busy to kill you, your grace. I am the king, Stannis hissed. The word came out like the sound a kettle makes when no one has lifted it from the fire in time. You are a good man who knows the law better than any man, Davos said, stubborn as rope, and Stannis' mouth twitched because he had not heard the word good applied to him in years except by a woman who burned gods. You are also a man with few ships and fewer friends. Melisandre, Stannis said, as if asking the fire itself whether it meant to eat him. If I go north and put my strength at the wall, will the Lord of Light keep account? Will he repay me my crown? The Lord of Light burns all tallies, Melisandre said, smiling into the fire. He loves only the light. If you carry it where others shiver in the dark, you will be nearer to him. Kingship lives there. Her eyes found Davos. He does not believe. He does, Davos said, nodding toward Stannis, and the red woman laughed lightly. Stannis thought a long time. When he at last spoke, his voice had the weary steadiness of a man who has made a decision that will cost him sleep. We sail north, he said. If we cannot take a throne from boys who play at crowns with roses and wolves, we will take a wall from old men and wear their thanks like a cloak. Davos's eyes warmed in spite of himself. Aye. On the Blackwater, the Tyrell fleet and those Valerian galleys that had not gone north to hustle Manderley cogs shepherded a convoy of grain into the city under a cold sky clear as washed glass. People cheered as sacks landed and carts creaked, and a rout of children tried to dive into a granary with the eager cunning of minnows in a beam of light. Jon had the master of coin open the granary doors with ceremony that felt to him, for once worth the pomp. The city needed to see food like a sign. He stood on the dais in the market and let the flour dust his cloak and watched a woman take a loaf in both hands and touch it to her cheek before she took it home as if she were carrying a child. He breathed. Then war took its price anyway. It took it first in the Riverlands, where Tywin tasted the smell of reach upon the wind and shifted his weight accordingly. Randyll Tarly, stiffer than iron and twice as cutting, ran up the Mander with a discipline that both impressed and enraged men whose pride had never been inspected. Loras rode stupid sometimes and brave always and suffered both reputations because men do not know where to put a knight who smells of perfume and bleeds better than any of them. They met the mountain by the forks of the Blackwater where it spread its brown hands against the earth. Bronn, whom Jon had put under a banner because a man who fought for coin sometimes fights truer than a man who fights for a song about his honor, took a company and pulled the teeth out of Gregor's scouts by showing them what the alleys had taught him. Men died in leather and mail and straw. Men died with wine on their breath and prayers on their tongues. A village burned and saved a dozen more because the fire kept Tywin from finding the ford that would have let him get behind Tarly and do what a Lannister always preferred to do: count costs only after he had taken what he wanted on credit. The battle broke messy as a field after pigs. Tywin withdrew in good order and a grey wrath. Tarly wiped his sword clean like a man finishing a task he would do again in the morning, because it was a task. Loras stood with blood on his cheek and his hair sticky and looked very young and very old and did not weep where men could see him. Later, when the camp breathed and the night fell and the quartermaster's tent hummed with the terrible arithmetic that follows every day a king spends men, Loras went outside the firelight and knelt and whispered Renly's name until his mouth remembered how to make the shape of silence. In King's Landing, Cersei Lannister learned to wait with the patience of a cat that has been forced inside by a reign it hates. She spoke sweetly to the High Septon and had the satisfaction of seeing his hands tremble in confusion at the softness of her asking and the steel under it. She sent wine to the Tower of the Hand, knowing Ned would never drink it, and smiled, imagining him thinking about why she had sent it. She fixed her son's hair with a comb she had used on him as a baby, and when he flinched, she held the comb out and broke it in half with 2 expert twists and told him very calm that he would learn not to flinch. "Why, Mother?" Joffrey asked, sullen, because he had never learned how to be afraid without becoming cruel to the nearest thing, and everything that did not bend to him frightened him. "Because men watch you," she said, and saw he did not understand and thought, not for the first time, that she had conjured a creature and could not call it back. "They watch the hand that holds the sword and the mouth that speaks the order and the eyes that betray the rest." When Pycelle sidled to her with news of letters and treaties, she regarded him as one regards furniture that has creaked too often and decided she was bored with him. She told Jaime so, and he shrugged and kissed her hand and said, "Do not let boredom make you foolish. Let anger do that." "Anger makes me sharp," Cersei said. "It makes you cut yourself," Jaime returned, and went away whistling to find a wall he could lean on and imagine toppling. Arya Stark climbed the roofs of Winterfell when the snow came properly and learned again how to crack ice in a bucket with the heel of her hand without splashing herself. She would wake with the dawn while the sky was still a thing the world was making, and she would practice the steps Syrio had shown her, as if she might wear them so deeply her bones would not forget. She missed her father and hated herself for it, the way children hate the parts of their love they cannot understand. She missed Jon and did not hate that. The winter town below the walls stirred and huddled and woke to work. She learned to move through it without leaving traces, not because she had a reason, but because it pleased something stubborn in her that a girl could do such a thing without anyone's permission. Robb watched her and let her be and did not tell her how often he sent a guard to trail her 4 bends behind. He took Hall with the bands her father had sent north from the king. Hard men out of the Stormlands who had never seen snow and looked up at Winterfell's walls with an honest awe that was the first step to love. Lean men out of the Crownlands, Mercer's second sons who had learned quickly enough how to swing a spear and were learning now how to swing it while their fingers grew stiff. Manderly mariners whose hands had rope burns and who smiled like men who have decided the thing to be done is within the strength of their shoulders if anyone will stop talking at them. He corresponded with White Harbor like a small lord trying to be a large one, and found to his surprise that he was often good at it. He laughed sometimes. The sound startled him because there were days when he forgot he could. Sansa stood on a balcony in the Red Keep and watched the city move under its own weight. She had come south again with her father because the king had found himself with a bride who must be taught how to love a city, and Sansa could be taught to walk beside her with grace and receive people's wishes as if they were gifts and not burdens. Marjorie took Sansa's hand sometimes and asked her questions that were both kind and sharp. "If I sit this throne," she would say, "how do I keep the ladies of the Crownlands from hating the ladies of the Reach more than they already do?" And Sansa would answer, honestly, sometimes wrongly, sometimes as if she had overheard something in a gown that cost more than a hall and learned to turn it into truth. Marjorie made her laugh sometimes by looking crossly at lemon cakes before devouring them. She told Sansa that she liked Ghost in theory but not in practice because his eyes made her feel foolish. Sansa said that was because Ghost knew more than both of them and did not care for their company, and Marjorie laughed again. "Will you be happy, your grace?" Sansa asked her once with all the bravery she had, which was the bravery of a girl who has decided court cannot crush what winter did not. "I will be busy," Marjorie said. "Sometimes that is the same thing." When the first long line of carts bearing logs and tar rolled through the King's Gate under a northern sky gone thin and glassy with cold, people cheered because men love fires in winter more than they love most kings. Jon had asked White Harbor for timber and got it. He had asked Driftmark for pine pitch and got that too. The mountain of cordwood grew on the north bank like a monument to a god older than any men prayed to. He sent out charcoal burners into the Kingswood with warrants signed by his hand and saw to it that no lord south of the Blackwater stopped them. Fire is bred in winter, old Nan used to say, and he found himself agreeing with a woman he had not seen in years and had mostly known by her stories and the smell of stewed onions. Maester Aemon did not like winter in King's Landing. The wet sunk into bone and stayed there and made him smile ruefully at his own folly. Yet he did not return to the wall, because he had come so far to say a thing and meant to keep saying it until men had had their fill of hearing. He sat by the brazier in the Tower of the Hand with a blanket over his knees, and when the wolf came in and laid his head upon Jon's thigh, Aemon reached a hand out into the air and Ghost came, puzzled and careful, so that the old man's fingers touched fur and he laughed like a child and like a very old man at once. "You named him Jon," Aemon said into the warmth and the scent of animal. "Once I met a man named Aegon who would not be king, and once I knew a king named Aegon who could not be only a man. Names are a game we play with the gods to make them think we understand what they are about." "I understand very little," Jon said, "but I will keep men alive. It is not much of a game, but it is mine. It is the only one any king ever wins," Aemon said. "Stannis' fleet beat up the coast with winter like a long hand laid upon it. They made White Harbor and found hospitality like a lion in velvet. Couches, pies, courtesy, and the heavy knowledge that the man who fed them hoped to be repaid in something more durable than thanks. Stannis sat at Wyman Manderly's table and stared at the pies as if they might reveal a sigil. The Red Woman smiled and said she preferred meat less cold. Davos ate until he felt he had been forgiven something, though he did not know what. They made Eastwatch by the sea through a snow that made the world seem like a thing forgotten under ash. The wall rose behind the harbor like the face of a god too proud to look down. Jeor Mormont met Stannis with a respect a general offers another general when men's deaths meet in the space between them and form a kind of brittle understanding. "We need men," Mormont said. "We need steel. We need men again. We need engineers who can make arrows 2 men high and men to carry the rope for the stones that crack the skulls of the dead, who come at us with no skull worth cracking." "You will have them," Stannis said. He had decided this in the way mountains decide things, slowly, with great weight, and in a way that could not be undecided by lesser weather. He stood upon the wall with Melisandre and watched the world stretch north under its winter skin, and the fire at his back made a red line on the ice that he saw and did not turn from. "I smell cold," the Red Woman said with a delight he did not trust. "That is what men do," Stannis said. "They smell it and then they die. Not here. Not while I have breath." Davos walked the yard at Castle Black and watched boys from King's Landing try to learn to knit their fingers without letting them go white, and he thought not of kings or gods but of the feel of a rope in his hands and his son's laughter. He sent a letter south with a ship bound for White Harbor, and in it, in his bad writing, he told a boy he had never met that his father was doing something he could say to a child without shame. "You would have liked him," he wrote to Jon Baratheon. "He would have liked you if he had been better at liking men." Jon read the letter in the Tower of the Hand while outside the city arranged itself for a winter wedding with Tyrell roses and northern pines. He folded it carefully and put it among the papers that were not paltry and not grand, the ones that lived in the middle of power and made it tolerable, letters from men who wanted nothing more than to do their work and sleep in peace. He thought of Stannis standing in wind a man could lean on, and he thought of the look that must be on Old Bear's face when he saw ships come into Eastwatch with men aboard who would not steal when a white put a blade in their bellies, and he smiled. He wed Marjorie Tyrell on a morning that dawned clear and stayed cruelly bright. The great September of Baelor filled with light and breath and the sweet old stink of incense that clung to stone in a way no wind could scour. The High Septon's hands were cool. The vows were old. The songs were newer. The look Marjorie gave him when the crown was lifted from her hair and then settled again with antlers near his own was a calculation that did not exclude warmth. He kissed her lightly and heard the city cheer and thought, as he often did now, of bread. At the feast afterward, Olenna Tyrell took his hand and patted it as if it belonged to a grandson she had chosen for herself and would defend with knives. "Do not be a fool," she advised, her voice low beneath the sugar. "Do not be wicked either. I have found that tiresome. Eat more than you drink. Trust fewer men than you want to. Keep my girl safe not because she is my girl but because if she dies, the realm will break in a way no one will love you enough to forgive. And, write to the wall on Sundays," she said. "Old men like Sundays." He wrote that very night, ink smudging his thumb. He wrote of wood and tar, of ships leaving before dawn, of men who had never seen snow being sent north with men who had never seen the sea. He asked what else the wall needed and put a note where men would see it that said, "I will come if I can." He sealed it with the stag and the dire wolf pressed together and gave it to a boy whose feet could not keep still and who looked at him as if he had been told a secret. King's Landing invented rumors the way cookshops invent stews, out of whatever was to hand and with a canny attention to what would sell. They said the new queen was already pregnant. They said she ate only apples and once bit a guard who startled her. They said the king went out at night with a white wolf and walked in flea bottom without a cloak and gave away rings to beggars. Rings that turned to string by morning and made men curse him. They said he meant to sell the Red Keep for grain and make all the nobles sleep on the city walls to keep them from talking. They said he had a lover in the north. They said he had no lovers and never would, because he slept with his crown on and woke with lines pressed into his brow and had no time for love if love could not carry a sack of flour. Cersei heard the rumors and repeated some of them where they would hurt and corrected others when it suited the game. She did not move openly now because the city had made it harder to move quietly. It watched her without meaning to, the way a man watches a fire after his house has burned once. She waited. When Tywin finally wrote that he would not withdraw to the rock like a beaten dog, and that if the Tyrells wished to marry their girl to a boy with cold in his teeth, they might, he would take his comfort in the old ways. Then she smiled and began again to speak to Jaime in a language only the two of them still remembered fluently. There were men she could still buy with pride. There were doors that did not close quickly enough against lions. There was wildfire in the city. She had learned the word at last and liked the taste of it. She planted the knowledge in a place where it would ripen. Varys learned it. Varys always did. He came to the Tower of the Hand in a sober dress of black velvet and stood quietly until Ned lifted his eyes. "They gather green fire as one gathers spices for a pie," he said, no music in the words now. "There is a man below the city who thinks he is a god. He is in love with fire as a poor man loves a rich woman. He believes she has promised him everything. Take him," Ned said at once. "He has friends," Varys said regretfully, "and holes in the tunnel that turn a man around when he thinks he is going straight. But yes," he folded his hands, "I will steal his god from him and put it back in the jars where it belongs." They took Helene's apprentices and his old recipes and his newest flame and put them under guard with the same seriousness they gave to the king's seal. Helene himself they gave a room with no corners and a bed that burned only when he asked for a candle. He cried once. It made Pycelle weep in sympathy and answered a question Ned had been asking himself quietly for months about where the old man's loyalties lay. Ned put Pycelle under a chamber that had seen other men learn that their walkway was smaller than they had thought. He visited the old man once, and when Pycelle began a speech about service to kings, he cut him off with a raised hand and an expression that had twice made Robert stop laughing and apologize when sober the next day. "Do not," Ned said. "I will not listen. It dishonors us both." Pycelle wept again without shame for himself or for words that had lost their use. Winter settled its shoulder against the realm and leaned. Stannis' men froze and learned how to thaw themselves and work stiff-handed. They learned how to sleep in pairs. They learned that the dead are heavier than you think when you have to keep killing them because they keep getting up. Jon's letters reached the wall and were read by cold hands near warm flames. Every time they came, the men leaned in, even those who could not read, and when the last word had been spoken aloud, they nodded and went back out into the dark. The folk beyond the wall moved like wind shadows. Sometimes they were men and sometimes they were not. Sometimes they were too many and sometimes they faded like the sea in a dream when you try to hold water in your hands. Old Bear Mormont wrote less and did more, which was always his way. In the Riverlands, Tarly scored Tywin and Tywin scored Tarly, and the scores did not tally because men are not numbers. Edmure Tully learned some cunning and forgot some pride. He saved a village because he loved children more than he loved the plan, and the plan had to be redrawn as a result, and Randall forgave him after 3 days of rage because the village had not burned. Men lived in it who could harvest a field next summer if there was a summer. The Gold Cloaks learned to take orders from a commander who had not bought them. The queen learned to endure a husband who did not pretend she was at the center of his sky, and the king learned to endure a wife who was a country all her own. Ghost took to sleeping across the doorway when Jon was at his table writing. Marjorie would step over him with the grace of a dancer and then pause to scratch his ear with a knuckle until the heavy head pressed into her hand and a sound came out of the wolf that was not a growl and not a purr but something old and satisfied. She began to go with Jon to the lower city without telling anyone who did not need to know. She learned to carry a loaf tucked in her cloak and to give it to the woman who would not ask. She learned to smile at men who looked like they might sell their knives for warmth and mean it. The realm learned the shape of a queen whose beauty was real and yet less important than the way she listened. One night, with frost etching the window like a careful hand's work and the room warm with 2 bodies and the honest heat of a brazier, Jon woke to find Ned in the doorway like the shadow of a younger man he had once known. "There has been a raven from the Eyrie," Ned said. "Tyrion Lannister lives." Jon sat up, the blanket falling to his waist and the cold reaching him like a question he had not prepared for. "I had almost forgotten we had not killed him," he said, and Marjorie made a sound of amusement, sleepy and surprised. "He wishes to come to King's Landing under safe passage," Ned said. "He writes like a man who has learned to make jokes into knives." He hesitated. "He writes as if he might be worth listening to. Send him amnesty to the gates and none beyond," Jon said. "He will come anyway. Men like him come to fires." Tyrion came with a scar he had not worn when last he'd drunk in the Winterfell hall and made rude friends with young wolves. He wore it like a badge, half in contempt, half in pride, and more than half because he refused to let any man tell him what a thing meant when he had language he trusted better. He bowed to Jon as if to a story he had been told in childhood that he had not wholly believed. He looked at Ned Stark as if to an old tree he had climbed once when he was smaller and scraped his knee and liked the pain because it had been clean and simple. "You did not hang me, which shows taste if not consistency," Tyrion said. "I bring you a head full of cleverness, a pocket full of bad habits, and an honest offer to use both on your enemies if you will let me. My enemies are hunger and cold, and a winter men prefer to pretend is only a story so they can sleep," Jon said. "Do your cleverness and your habits work on those?" "Sometimes," Tyrion said, pleased, "and sometimes they do not. But the times they do, the rooms get warmer." Marjorie served him wine and olives and watched him nibble at them like a squirrel investigating a new kind of nut. "We have this in common," she said. "We prefer rooms warm. And we prefer fools to be the other side of the door," Tyrion returned. "We shall get along." He sat on the small council within the fortnight and made Varys smile openly once, which in turn made Ned frown, which made Tyrion grin like a boy in mischief. He rewrote a tariff, coaxed a loan out of a man who disliked being coaxed, and told Haleen the pyromancer that he made a sound like a kettle when he lied. He asked after Sansa as if he had met her more often than the once at Winterfell, and when Jon told him she was learning to be Queen's shadow and City's listener, he nodded as if a plan he had had for someone long ago had not come to pass and he had found a better one here. "I hear your father lights fires in the west," Jon said to him. "He does," Tyrion replied. "He also pours oil in his wine and calls it flavor. I would rather taste the wine." "We will taste the wine," Jon said. "We will make sure there is wine to taste." Winter rode down out of the north as if it had been waiting to be called. It set the neck to steaming like a thing cooking too slowly. It sealed small ponds and slowed big rivers. It found holes between stones in old keeps and made them whisper secrets. At the wall, the dead came down to test the timber in the cold and the will in warm bellies. Stannis's banners stiffened. His men made fires. Melisandre stared into flame until the reflection of her face there changed into something that was only her in outline and otherwise light. Davos stood beside a boy from the docks who had never owned shoes not stolen and watched the world and said nothing. The boy leaned into him for warmth, as boys will even when they have told themselves they are men. They held a line that was not a line but a way of being. We will stand here. We will not move back unless we must. We will move forward when we can and call it victory even if it only wins us a winter's day. Jeor Mormont slept in bursts and woke like an old bear from honey and hungers and immediately wanted to bite something. He wrote to Jon less because there was less to say that mattered beyond the same word, repeated in different orders. Come. Jon went north. It was a decision that read like folly and felt like necessity. He left Ned and Marjorie with a council that could govern a city and a war and a winter for a little while. He left Ser Barristan with his queen. He left Sandor with his wolf. He left Tyrion with his ledger. He left Varys with his whispers and Peter with his dagger smiles and Aemon with his letters. He took 100 men and more than 100 reasons. He took the road as a man takes a vow, knowing that at least two things he could not foresee would break against him hard enough to bruise. The king's road ran cold as a taut string. It sang under their horses' hooves. The winter town at Winterfell had swelled with men come in from crofts and Godswood margins. Robb met Jon under the portcullis with a grin that made him forget for a moment how heavy his own heart had grown. "You married a rose," Robb said accusingly later over meat and a cup of small beer because small beer makes for truer talk. "I married a road," Jon answered. "She is a good road. We can use roads," Robb said. And then the grin fell and he leaned forward with sudden intensity. "You will go on. You will go to the wall. Take me. You must keep Winterfell," Jon said. "You must keep the North. You must keep it like a hand over a candle if we are to have any light to come back to." Arya stood behind Robb with her chin lifted and said, "Take me?" And he laughed and kissed her forehead and said, "When you can beat me with a stick." And she said, "I already can." And he went away happier for a time. Ghost went ahead of the column and returned and went again. He was all ripple and attention, and the old wildness that made men remember the world had been made before their words. When they reached the wall at last, Jon felt the cold go through the leather and the wool and the skin to find the place in a man that holds still no matter a king's crown. He looked up and saw the thing that had held his boyhood awe and fear and fury and hope and knew that it held still. Jeor Mormont met him on the yard and did not kneel and did not bow and hugged him hard enough to make the crown shift in his hair, and then swore and straightened it with hands that did not shake until after he drew them back. "You are a fool," he said, voice low enough for only Jon to hear. "A good fool. I am angrier at you than I have been at anyone in a year. I am more grateful to you than I can fit into my bad words. Come, I will show you where men die and where they live between dying." They climbed the wall. The wind pressed itself into Jon's lungs and made his eyes water, as if someone had told him a story he could not cry at. The world fell away on either side like a fact. To the south, the realm he had chosen to hold spread itself, beloved and quarrelsome and warm. To the north, the white skin of the land wrapped itself around bones he could not see and whispered nothing at all. He put his hand on the ice and it held his palm like a father's hand who has worked a lifetime and still has strength to hold. Stannis stood at the far end of the parapet with Melisandre tucked into the lee of a windbreak and Davos at his back like a shadow that refused to be dislodged. Stannis nodded once at Jon without smiling. "You have come to steal my war," he said without rancor. "You have come to make it possible for me to steal anything later," Jon returned. "I will buy you wine when we can drink outside without our cups freezing to our lips." "You will buy me a throne," Stannis said dryly. "I will count your ships when spring melts," Jon said. "And we will see." Melisandre's red eyes glimmered. "I saw a stag with a crown of frost and a wolf with a crown of fire," she said in a voice that made something small in Jon flinch and then settle. I saw the night open and a sword lifted that was not made of any man's metal. I saw death step to the side like a gentleman and let life pass for a season. You see so much, Davos muttered. I wish you saw more hunger. I see it, she said. It burns small. Small fires keep men alive, Davos said, and then he smiled at Jon, unexpected and warm. Welcome, your grace. We keep a poor table and a good wall. Good, Jon said. Walls are better than tables. They held council in a cold room and their words steamed as if they were horses after a ride. The plan they made had no beauty. It had the utility of a raft under men who cannot swim. They would not ride far. They would crush raids. They would push back where they could and not regret drawing lines where they had to. They would build fires along the wall's crown and feed them like pets too fierce to trust at their backs. They would keep count of their dead and say their names and then say the names of the living more often so men would remember which ledger mattered. At dusk, Jon walked the top of the wall alone until Ghost found him and leaned shoulder to thigh. He looked north and thought of a woman he could not name and a promise he had never understood and a song he had never been taught that nonetheless ran in him like a stream under earth. He looked south and thought of Marjorie's quick mind and Ned's patience and Tyrion's wit and Varys's breath and Peter's knife and Cersei's smile and Jaime's laugh that had sounded, for one beat, like relief when steel met steel. He thought of bread. He thought of fire. He thought of the crown that sat on his hair and pressed a bruise he had learned to live with. He breathed, and the breath came out in smoke, and the smoke went up, and it was nothing, and it was a sign. He began to speak to Ghost, low and foolish, because men do that to animals when the wind is too large for their heads. I do not know the end, he said. I know that this is the place where we must be men, as the old stories meant the word and not as songs use it now. I know that if we hold and do not let ourselves be clever when we should be kind, or kind when we should be hard, we might see a spring that makes the realm remember how to laugh. Ghost did not answer. The wolf leaned his weight harder for a moment and then moved off into the white, his coat disappearing until only the eyes marked where he was. Jon stood a while longer in the old cold, with men moving below like ants whose work makes empires possible. The world did not end. He went down to a table where there was bad stew and good bread. He ate. He listened. He wrote a letter by poor light in a large hand that a boy could read to a hall without stumbling, and he signed it as he had promised some months past, before the crown, before the vows, before the white fires and the green jars and the smell of flour in the market. He signed it simply and sent it south with a man who walked quickly when he had bread in his pack. Jon.